Our grand tour continues in the Mediterranean world. Here in Module 5, we are going to look at the art of ancient Greece and Rome. And collectively, these two civilizations are referred to as classical civilizations. So anytime from now on, if you hear the term classical, that's what it refers to, Greece and Rome. Now, it's pretty hard to overstate how important these two civilizations are for us in the Western world today. Both Greece and Rome have made an indelible imprint, both on Europe and even in the United States. A lot of that is going to become more clear as we unpack the culture of these two ancient civilizations. We're going to start with Greece. Here's a map of ancient Greece. There are probably some familiar looking cities to you. Some of these you may be familiar with from Bible classes or even from popular culture. Thinking of the movie 300, for example, that came out a few years ago. So here on this Greek peninsula basically emerged countless ideas that continue to shape us today. And think about all the Greek things that we still have with us. Our conception of the theater, for example, the Olympics, democracy, certain works of literature and philosophy. All of these have their foundations in ancient Greek culture. But perhaps the most overriding, influential concept that the Greeks have bequeathed to us is the idea of humanism. And this is basically a word that means people have inherent worth and value, that people are important. It is a view of life that holds the human being often at its center or at a very high place. And the Greeks were humanists in a major way. They not only thought that people were important, but sometimes that people were absolutely the center of the universe. There are all kinds of quotes that talk about this concept of Greek humanism, such as the Greeks made their gods into men and their men into gods, meaning, of course, that in stories of Greek mythology, the gods often have human characteristics, such as being fickle and backstabbing and jealous and angry. And it also means that the Greeks celebrated humanity and even the human figure at a level that had never been celebrated before. Another famous Greek quote, "Man is the measure of all things," suggesting that people become the basis of comparison for everything in the world. Now, one thing to get straight about the Greeks, this idea of humanism permeates every aspect of their visual culture. The Greeks are basically the civilization that invents the nude in art. The Greeks love nothing more than celebrating the human body. And in fact, one of their phrases is a sound mind and a sound body. This idea that the most perfect thing, the best thing you can be, is a really smart, sharp, quick-witted person who has developed not only mental faculties, but has those in a body that has been trained, whether for games or battle, but everything in your life being brought to the absolute level of perfection. And this completely comes out in their art. By the way, before I get into this too deeply into this idea of Greek art, let's look at this little spectrum here. This is what I call the humanism spectrum, and it suggests kind of the range of options that are available for those who embrace humanism. On one end of the spectrum, of course, you have the Greeks, who would contend that man is God, that man is the pinnacle achievement of creation. The other end of the spectrum, something we might see more in the Middle Ages, although I don't want to say exclusively in the Middle Ages, is the idea that man is a worm, that people are scumbags, that are worthy of nothing more than being wiped off God's boot. Now, the question is, for those who are Christians, where is the healthy balance? Where should we be on the spectrum? Probably somewhere in the middle. The Bible showing clearly that God values people, values humanity, that people have worth. But obviously people should not be in the place of God. There is always a higher power for those of us who are Christians. So that's just kind of an interesting reflection on the different places you can go with humanism. But back to the Greeks. The Greeks, in their art, celebrate the human body like no other civilization before them has done. And everywhere in Greek art, you see the body, sometimes semi clothed, sometimes nude, it just kind of depends. But in any case, the human body gets top notch treatment from the Greeks. Let's start off looking at a really early example of this, and this is in Greek vase painting. Remember this idea that a lot, if not most, early art is going to be utilitarian in nature. It's going to be useful for something. And we certainly see this in Greek vases, which are going to be for storing various things, maybe wine or olive oil. And even these humble utilitarian objects are richly decorated with people. And one of the things the Greeks like to do on their vases is to tell stories about their civilization. So you have mortal heroes, you have gods and goddesses. A lot of scenes from Greek mythology are featured on these vases. So, for example, in this first slide of what we call black figure vases, look at the right-hand image. This is an image of Theseus slaying the Minotaur in the labyrinth. If you remember that story from your civilization classes, or maybe you've read mythology in your English classes. The Greeks love their heroes, and they love showing the body in motion. And notice that the Greeks are going to idealize the human figure whenever they portray it. All Greek heroes are basically going to have perfect bodies. They're going to be eternally young. They're going to be beautiful. No wrinkles, no guts, no receding hairlines, nothing like that. All Greek figures are basically perfect. Now, this first example of vases we see are the earliest kinds of Greek vases. These are called black figure vases for obvious reasons. All the people and all the things that are featured as positive space in these vases are represented with black paint. Now, these are clay vases. They're terracotta. They have been made out of clay, and then they've been fired in an oven, which turns them red. And then they're painted on with black paint, and the black paint, again, just is brought into the positive areas of the vases, and the negative space is left as the red clay of the vase. Black figure vases date from the 500s and even earlier, from the 600s and maybe even 700s BC. And they went on like this for a while until some brilliant artist looked around and said, you know, most of the people around me do not have like jet black skin. Perhaps our skin color is closer to the red of the clay. And so vase painters began to, instead of painting the positive space or the figures black, they began to paint the negative space or the background black. And they would leave the red of the vase as the skin color. So we see that in the second style of Greek vase painting. It's called red figure vases. And so now you can go into any museum that's worth its salt, and you can tell the difference in the black figure and red figure vases. And you can also know which one is older. It's always the black figure vases that are going to be older. So notice again these red figure vases. The human figure is the main subject, and stories of gods and goddesses are happening in this as well. I want to jump now from these earlier, more stylized, flat depictions of people to some examples of the Greeks at their absolute best in depicting the human figure. This is going to happen during what we call the Hellenistic period, which is the peak of Greek civilization, especially in their artwork. Let's look at an example of one of the greatest Greek sculptures ever made. This is the famous Nike, or Winged Victory, of Samothrace. A lot more recent than the vase painting, and you can tell the Greeks have really come a long way in their ability to depict the human figure realistically. This is a sculpture that is at the Louvre, and it's been admired for just years and years and years for its beauty. And which is a funny thing, because it's a sculpture that's missing its head and its two arms. And I think that just reflects the veneration for this sculpture, the fact that people just drool over it and it's incomplete and broken and missing parts. This depicts, again, the goddess of victory, and more than likely she was holding a crown in her hands, a laurel crown or a crown made of leaves, holding that out in front of her. And apparently the initial location for the sculpture was on a pedestal that was shaped to look like the front of a ship. It was probably originally a monument commemorating a naval victory. And the idea is this woman was standing on the bow of the ship and she was getting splattered with the spray of the ocean, and the wind was blowing against her. And you really have a sense of this dynamic emotion of fabric blowing against her torso. If you look closely at the sculpture, we have a sense, even though this is a sculpture carved out of marble, we have a sense that there's fabric actually draped over a human body, that the human body, the leg, for example, underneath, is pushing through the fabric. It is a sculpture that has a beautiful rhythm to it and displays a really high level of technical ability on the part of the anonymous sculptor who made it. And I should mention, by the way, this is the same goddess of victory, Nike, who gives her name to the shoe company. So here is yet another way the Greeks have influenced us even today. Let's look at another sculpture, shall we? This is going to be the other super famous Greek sculpture you should know about. This, of course, is Venus de Milo. It depicts Venus, or Aphrodite, of course, the goddess of love. And like Nike of Samothrace, it's missing some parts. She is missing her arms. One arm used to extend across her torso and was holding up her dress that was just sort of starting to fall off. The other hand was extended in front of her and once held an apple. Now, this is a sculpture that is a little bit teasing, right? There's a sexual kind of element to it. The clothes are just barely hanging on there, and she's just barely keeping them on. So there's that kind of sensual aspect to this sculpture. There's also reference to the Greek myth called the Judgment of Paris, which explains why the apple was in her hand. And here's how the story goes. Zeus held a banquet, and a lot of gods and goddesses were invited to it, but there was this one goddess named Eris, the god of discord, who did not make the cut. Apparently, she was not fun to have around. So, embittered by this rejection, Eris made this apple, this golden apple that was inscribed with the words, "To the fairest one." And she rolled this into the party. And wouldn't you know it, the apple rolls at the feet of three goddesses, three of the most important goddesses, these being Hera, Venus, or Aphrodite, and Athena. And immediately these goddesses begin squabbling over who this apple should belong to, because each of them claims to be the fairest. Remember, this is very Greek. It is giving their gods human characteristics. And so they ask Zeus to judge amongst them who the fairest one is, and Zeus, being pretty smart, says, "No, I'm not going to do the judging. I'm going to defer this judgment to a mortal," and he chooses this dude named Paris. So these vain goddesses present themselves to Paris, and each offers him a different bribe in return for choosing her. Hera offers him riches and kingdoms, offers to make him a ruler. Athena offers him wisdom and abilities in making warfare. And Aphrodite decides to award him the hand of the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, someone who is driven apparently by his hormones, chooses the prettiest woman in the world, of course. And this, as you might know, ends up being Helen of Troy. Now, the problem is Helen of Troy is already married to somebody else. So the Trojan War actually begins when Paris gets some folks and they go and they kidnap Helen. So bad news, and it all starts with a stinking golden apple. And that's what Venus de Milo was initially holding in her hand. Going back to the sculpture, this is a great example of what we call contrapposto. Contrapposto is a fancy word that describes how this statue is standing. She's standing with most of the weight on one leg. In this case, it's her right leg. And this makes her hips tilt at an angle. And notice her left knee is bent. And this is just classic contrapposto pose. And if you look around at most people who are just standing around, this is what humans do. We put more weight on one leg than the other. And this is a huge leap forward in terms of realism for sculpture. Think back to the image of Menkaure and his queen, how both feet are flat on the ground. And think about the Egyptian painting we looked at. Again, both feet flat on the ground. With Contrapposto, there is a very naturalistic and realistic sort of shift going on in the weight. And both Venus de Milo and Nike of Samothrace have that. Another word on Greek sculpture before we move along here, we think of Greek and indeed Roman sculpture as well as being all white. And what you should know is that initially Greek and Roman sculpture was painted. It was painted often in very vibrant, brilliant colors. It's just that over the years, these colors have worn off and faded away and that sort of thing, leaving us with the original white marble that these sculptures were carved out of. Remember that Greek sculpture is going to set the standard for hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards. In fact, by the time we get to the Renaissance, all the Renaissance sculptors are going to be comparing themselves to the Greeks and trying to do as good a job as the Greeks did in their sculpture. All right, let's move on to architecture and check out some of the most famous Greek buildings. We are going to travel to Athens to do this. Here we see a couple of images of this thing called the Acropolis in Athens. And Acropolis is actually a generic Greek word for just high place. It describes any elevated part of a city that often had structures built on it. And there are many acropolises all over the Greek world. This one is just the most famous one. It's in Athens, the most important Greek city. And it's so famous and so important that it is known as the Acropolis, capital A. And what we have on the Acropolis is a collection of temples and important buildings for the citizens of Athens. In fact, this is the main place the nerve center of Athens, both religiously and culturally. And the most famous building on the Acropolis of Athens is the Parthenon. You've probably heard of it and seen it. Here we see a little model of the Acropolis, and you can see a reconstruction of the Parthenon. This is a temple to Athena. There's actually a replica of it in Nashville, Tennessee. If you ever go to Nashville, you should check that out. And it initially held a massive, several stories tall statue of Athena herself. So this is a place of worship. But we're going to focus actually on how the building looks and some features and qualities of its construction. One of the first things you notice when you look at it is that it has no roof. The roof was actually blown off of it in the 1600s when the Turks and the Venetians were fighting, and the Turks had some ammunition and gunpowder stored in the Parthenon. This is long after, of course, it was an active temple. And there was a stray artillery round that hit it, and it exploded. And now the roof of the Parthenon lies scattered around it on the ground, so you can see all the rubble around it. Now, why is the Parthenon so famous, considering that it's like practically half blown up? And the answer is this building is the epitome of the Greek love of beauty and orderly design in their architecture. And indeed, it's a marvelously proportioned building. There's something just really pleasing about looking at it, how long it is compared to how wide it is, and how tall it is compared to the width of the facade. And the Greeks designed this building very intentionally according to a mathematical ratio called the golden section. And you may remember reading about this in the part of the class on principles of design. The golden section is a harmonious mathematical relationship from which can be derived a rectangle called the golden rectangle that is somehow just a very pleasing rectangle to look at. And this golden rectangle is used all over the place on the Parthenon. And here in this next slide, we see the golden rectangle overlaying the facade of the Parthenon. And of course, we have to reconstruct some of the roof there because the roof is missing. But you can see how it very neatly fits into a golden rectangle. So, from the get-go, this building was designed with beautiful, harmonious proportions. But there are other secrets to the Parthenon and how it looks. For example, the floor of the Parthenon, on which the columns are resting, is bulged slightly. It's not exactly straight across. It's higher in the middle than it is on the sides. And this does a couple of things. For one thing, it sheds rainwater, but more importantly for the building's design, it compensates for an optical illusion that happens if you place columns on a flat level surface. If you do that, it appears that the floor sags in the middle. And so to compensate for this optical illusion, the Greeks sort of domed up the floor in the middle to make sure their building didn't look like it was sagging. Also, the columns at the outer edge are a little bit thicker than the columns towards the middle, and that's to compensate for light shining through the sides and making the columns appear thinner. So you have all these very well thought out, difficult to design and manufacture modifications in the Parthenon to make it look beautiful. And that is totally a Greek theme. They love beauty, and all of their stuff looks beautiful and idealized. Now, the Parthenon's a good excuse to introduce you to the different Greek architectural styles, or orders. Order is just a fancy word for style here. And in this next slide, we see the different architectural orders. And the reason I want you to look at these is because I want you to be aware of them, because they're still around with us today. The Parthenon is the first kind, the kind that's on the left. That's called the Doric order, or Doric style. And it is characterized by a column that has a very simple capital, or top on it. Look at the very top of that column, and you can see it's simply a smooth beveled edge. The second Greek style is known as the Ionic style, and it has these little swirly spiral things on it. They remind me of cinnamon rolls. So you can recognize the Ionic order by looking for the little cinnamon rolls on top of the column. The third style is called Corinthian, and it is the busiest and most complicated of the three styles. It has a lot of little leaf petal looking things on top of it. You can see that happens in at least a couple of sort of levels or layers on the column, and it's the busiest looking one. Now, all three of these styles are going to be ripped off from the Greeks by the Romans. The Romans are going to use the three Greek architectural styles, but we're also going to have these styles in buildings all throughout Europe, and even in the United States. You go to Washington, D.C., you're going to see the Greek orders appearing in buildings all over the place. In many ways, the National Mall in D.C. is a collection of Greek temples, because, of course, the Founding Fathers wanted to associate themselves with the Greek ideas of democracy, and they also wanted to establish a country that had a certain timelessness to it, this idea that America would be around for a long time, just like the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. So we have that in national architecture as well. All right, the last Greek building we're going to look at is, like the Parthenon, super famous. It's called the Erechtheion. It is located on the Acropolis, and it's a quirky little building. The floor plan of it is irregular. It's not just a rectangle like the Parthenon. And it is apparently a shrine that was built to encapsulate some sacred sites on the Acropolis, which accounts for its irregular footprint. It goes back to a story of the founding of Athens. Supposedly, Athena and Poseidon were arguing over who would get to claim the city of Athens, or at least the land that was to become the city of Athens. And they had a little contest. You'll notice contests figure into a lot of these early Greek myths. Poseidon took his trident, his spear, and he struck the rock of the Acropolis. And out of the gouge that his spear left, there bubbled a salt spring. Athena made a tree grow, an olive tree, sprout on the rock of the Acropolis. And the people who were doing the judging decided, you know, an olive tree is a lot more handy and useful than a saltwater spring. So Athena, you win. And that's why Athens is called Athens, named after Athena, and not Poseidonia or something like that, named after Poseidon. So The Erechtheion is a building that encapsulates both of these sites. There is the place where supposedly Athena's olive tree grew, and there's also supposedly a gouge in the rock where the trident struck it, and this building sort of reaches out and encloses both of these things. The building was probably named after an early king named Erechtheus. Little fun fact there. But the most important thing art historically about the Erechtheion is a specific part of it called the Porch of the Maidens. And here are some close ups of the Porch of the Maidens. And here we have the Greeks ditching their standard columns altogether and replacing the columns with actually these contrapposto female figures, of course, beautiful and young and idealized. And these are special architectural elements called caryatids. And caryatids are, that's just really a word that means a female figure or sculpture that is acting in a load bearing manner. It basically replaces a column. So the Porch of the Maidens is really famous for its caryatids that stand there holding up the roof of this little porch on their heads.
Well, that wraps up our exploration of Greek art. Stick around and we will delve into the art of the Romans.